Welcome everyone to our webinar today. We are launching a partnership with the National Human Trafficking Hotline. My name is Andrea Sparks. I'm with the Governor's Child Sex Trafficking team, and we're hoping that you all and your task forces and coalitions will find this webinar useful to not only talk about, to learn about the National Human Trafficking Hotline, but also about trafficking in Texas and what the new partnership will encompass. Just so you know, we have a partnership with Polaris and the National Human Trafficking Hotline to raise awareness of the hotline and of human trafficking in Texas, to facilitate mandatory reporting of child sex trafficking and exploitation, to ensure that the protocols to connect reports and tips to law enforcement are as robust as they can be, to really enhance the Victim Services Referral Directory for Texas, and to share data and help us identify trends in Texas that can inform our strategies. Just to remind you real briefly of our strategies on the child sex trafficking team, we've got a slide here that lays them out in star form. Of course, we are the Lone Star State, but our comprehensive strategies include protecting children by building their awareness of and resilience to child exploitation, and also by curbing demand for child sex trafficking, recognizing sexual exploitation in all its forms by raising public awareness and implementing screening tools for victims. And we are implementing the SEEIT tool, Commercial Sexual Exploitation Identification Tool, throughout the state of Texas. Recovering victims with protective and empowering, not punitive, responses. And we want those responses to be collaborative and coordinated, spanning multiple systems. So no matter if a child is in juvenile justice or in DSPS custody, or is it community youth who needs help, we want them to have access to those coordinated trauma-informed responses. We want to restore survivors through trauma-informed and responsive services and supports they need to heal and thrive. The governor's office has already invested about $38 million in combating child sex trafficking and adult trafficking, and the vast majority of those dollars have gone toward restoring victims and providing them the services they need. And we want to, of course, bring justice for survivors by holding their traffickers, their buyers, their exploiters, those who profit from trafficking accountable. We believe that this partnership with the National Human Trafficking Hotline will help us in all of these different strategies. So we're really super excited to announce this to you all. Okay, so the next slide talks about how we're doing this, and just this is a reminder that we're working statewide with DSPS and TJJD and TABC and DPS and TDLR, Department of Licensing and Regulation, and TxDOT, and a whole bunch of our state agencies and systems to really enhance their statewide responses. But we're also developing regional continua of care throughout the state. We have 5 regions throughout the state that we're doing that in. What that means is that we want every region to have everything it needs to serve these victims and serve them well. And then we're implementing that local care coordination, which I just mentioned to you, with the Children's Advocacy Centers of Texas. Next slide, please. We are, as I said, we have 5 regions throughout the state, literally north, south, east, west, and central. We have 3 regional administrators who are working on building that continuum of care in their regions. We need 2 more. We're looking for regional administrators in West and South Texas. So if you or anyone you know is interested, please go to our website, gov.texas.gov, and look under employment, and you will find those positions there. Those regional administrators are tasked with helping communities enhance what they're doing, assess where the gaps are, fill the gaps, build upon the strengths, and then eventually implement care coordination in their local areas. And that's all I have at this time. I'm going to turn it over to Polaris and the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they will talk to you about our new partnership and also just more broadly about how the hotline works. Please, 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 we kept this webinar
pretty, I guess, small compared to some of our other webinars, because we want you to be able to answer, we want you to be able to ask questions and us to be able to answer your questions. That's very, very important to us. We don't want this to just be us talking to you. We want to hear what your questions are and your concerns are and let us know so we can have a dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea. We are thrilled to be here today and to be hosting this webinar and for our partnership with Texas. My name is Caroline DeMar, and I'm the Director of the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I am joined today by Jenny Sell and Sam Gillis, who are the Hotline's partnership managers for service providers and law enforcement, respectively. Before we begin, I want to review just a couple logistics. Andrea mentioned this, and it was written in the chat. But throughout the presentation, you'll be able to submit questions or comments in the chat box in the GoToMeeting. And we will periodically break from the presentation to answer submitted questions and also take additional questions. We want this presentation to be as beneficial for you and therefore encourage you to submit those questions so that we are sure to address any misconceptions, concerns, or confusion. This presentation will serve as an introduction to the National Human Trafficking Hotline and child sex trafficking in the United States and Texas. We will highlight the hotline's partnerships with various law enforcement and service providers that enable the hotline to have a coordinated local response to trafficking in Texas. We've also included an interactive component that reviews some of the myths and misconceptions about trafficking. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is a 24/7 confidential and multilingual lifeline that provides support and a variety of options for survivors of human trafficking to get connected to help and stay safe in the U.S. and the U.S. territories. We respond to cases of sex and labor trafficking and serve adult and minor victims, U.S. citizens, and foreign nationals. The hotline serves two main functions for survivors. First is an avenue for reporting trafficking situations to trained and trusted law enforcement agencies. And most importantly, it's a way to connect to resources and referrals across the country for various social and legal services. We also provide resources to community members and professionals about human trafficking and how to serve survivors. Polaris has been operating the National Human Trafficking Hotline since December 7th of 2007. Every 3 years, we must recompete to continue operating the hotline and have been fortunate to be awarded the cooperative agreement every 3 years since 2007. We are a nonprofit, non-governmental organization based in Washington, D.C., and we are funded through the Department of Health and Human Services and other private donors and supporters. It's important to note that we are funded at $1.75 million, and you'll see on this slide, that's only about 43% of our overall budget, which is close to $4 million to $4.5 million. Additionally, I want to highlight again that we are not a government entity, law enforcement agency, or direct service provider. However, we work closely with these partners in order to support individual victims and survivors of trafficking and the anti-trafficking field. The hotline has grown tremendously over the past 11 years. We now have a team of over 70 people. Instead of a pen and paper that we used 11 years ago to take notes and to collect data, we now have advanced technological systems and nuanced protocols to ensure high-quality case response, which helps us build trust among survivors and the anti-trafficking community. In order to give you an idea of our scope and capacity, here is a brief overview of our key hotline statistics from 2007 through 2017. We identified and responded to over 42,000 cases of human trafficking. We've reported over 10,000 of those to law enforcement. We've built and continue to manage 290 referral and reporting protocols, which Sam will get into and Jenny a little bit later in the presentation. And we've had over 9,500 survivors contact the hotline directly for assistance. In 2017, there were over 8,500 human trafficking hotline cases reported in the U.S. due to the hotline, and we expect that number to be close to 11,000 for 2018. Those numbers are still being cleaned up, but we have initial numbers that look like it's going to be right around 11,000, which is extremely exciting. You'll notice on this heat map, the red areas indicate the highest concentration of cases handled by the hotline. However, it's important to note that this map does not highlight the prevalence of trafficking in the U.S., but instead reflects where the awareness about trafficking and the hotline. This graph is the total of signals coming into the hotline. It's important to note that year over year, we continue to see an increase in signals and cases reported to the hotline. In this graph, you'll see a dramatic increase in the total signals, which means calls, emails, web forms reaching the hotline year over year. This graph was through 2017, and so we had not added chat and text, so the modes of communication at that time were calls, emails, and web forms. We expect that the increased awareness about the hotline and trust in the hotline has led to this increase in signals, and expect the numbers to dramatically surpass 2017 numbers with the addition of text and chat this year. Why does the hotline work? There are several reasons why the National Human Trafficking Hotline works well as a national model, as opposed to, say, a state or local model. For starters, it's a single memorable number. Although movement of a victim is not required for a case to be considered trafficking, traffickers may move their victims around as a means of control. And therefore, with one memorable number, victims and survivors don't have to spend time researching who to call at their new location, and instead can call our hotline, and we can assess their situation and connect them with resources in their desired location. That leads me to my next point, which the hotline acts as a 24/7 coordination center. We have the infrastructure and resources to assist victims and survivors in the anti-trafficking field 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, anywhere in the U.S. and U.S. territories in more than 200 languages. It's important to note, though, that the systems and policies and procedures to operate in this fashion can be time-consuming to develop and come with a large price tag, which might not be feasible for smaller organizations or states or local hotlines to undertake. Polaris, as I mentioned earlier, Polaris began operating the hotline about 11 years ago. And we were operating at that time, as I mentioned, with a few people on staff, a cordless phone, a notepad of paper. However, now we have multiple data systems, technologies, and a complex shift schedule that allows for 24/7 coverage and the ability to answer multiple calls, texts, and chats simultaneously. Additionally, for the past 11 years, the hotline has worked with local coalitions, task forces, and other key partners to build a database of over 4,000 service provider and law enforcement personnel, which allows us to provide a highly localized response, although we are a national hotline. Again, Jenny, our partnership manager for service providers, will go into greater detail about that directory a little bit later in the presentation. But because of this robust database, the hotline is able to manage complex, long-term, and multi-jurisdictional cases, which offers continuity for survivors and others reaching out to the hotline. Next, the hotline is a centralized data collection and analysis hub, which allows us to detect new trends and identify promising practices and gaps in trafficking networks, law enforcement response, and in victim services. And lastly, we have government support, yet NGO independence. With government support and funding, the hotline is sustainable, but it is also important that we have our independence and separation from the government in order to build and maintain trust among survivors and community members, and to make sure we remain flexible to adapt as the anti-trafficking landscape evolves. While many of these components of why the hotline works and why the national model is what we feel to be the ideal model, and maybe sound feasible for a local hotline to accomplish, capacity and funding restraints can make it very difficult for smaller entities to provide the continuity of care that survivors want, regardless of their location and complexity of their needs. As I mentioned, the hotline has evolved tremendously over the past 11 years and Polaris has operated it. As of 2018, we started as a single number to call in times of need, but however, now we are a sophisticated multimodal helpline that offers a variety of communication methods that suit different survivor and community member needs. As of January 2018, the National Hotline offers signalers 5 options to reach out for assistance: phone, text, chat, email, and online kit form. The text and chat 24/7 was a new addition last year, which we were truly excited that HHS recognized the need to add these into the cooperative agreement. Prior to that, we were operating phone, email, and web forms, and text just one shift a day. And so now we have 24/7 text and chat in addition to the other 3 modes of communication. So people can call the national hotline at 1-888-373-7888. The line is answered live 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Callers can speak to the hotline in English or Spanish or in more than 200 languages using a interpreter service. Hearing and speech impaired individuals can contact the hotline by dialing 711, the free national access number that connects to telecommunications relay services. They can also text help or info to 233-733 in English or Spanish. And we found that this is a preferred method of communication for minors and survivors alike, as it allows for more confidentiality and anonymity that survivors are sometimes looking for. And for minors, it is their preferred method of communication. People can chat via the National Hotline's web portal in English or Spanish. They can email us at help@humantraffickinghotline.org or report a tip online using our online tip reporting form. And lastly, the National Hotline offers a diverse services and resources through our web portal at www.humantraffickinghotline.org. Now Jenny is going to speak a little bit more in depth about what happens when someone contacts the National Hotline.
Hi everybody, this is Jenny. I am the Service Provider Partnership Manager for the hotline. I was also an advocate on the hotline for about 1.5 years prior to entering this role, so I have a pretty good experience on what it's like to engage with signalers and the different types of signalers that can reach out to the hotline. So one of the questions that I often get is, who calls you? You know, you don't actually get calls from victims, right? The short answer is that we get calls from everybody. The National Hotline serves the entire U.S. and U.S. territories, and anyone in need of assistance or information and resources related to the issue of human trafficking can contact us and access our services. So we get calls from everyone, from survivors themselves, both in and out of their situations, as well as concerned family and friends. We get calls from service providers and law enforcement seeking assistance on behalf of the survivor, as well as from a range of community members and other professionals wanting to report a tip or assist a survivor. So this graph that you see here, similar to the one that Caroline presented earlier, is about the number of survivors reaching out to the hotline, the number of signals from survivors reaching out to the hotline. A lot of people are surprised that we do get calls from survivors and victims, when in fact survivors of trafficking were the second most common caller type reaching out to the hotline in 2017. The most common was community members. Our data also shows that more survivors are reaching out to the hotline year after year. This graph shows that both the number of signals we receive from survivors, which is the reddish-orange line, and the numbers of survivors themselves, which is that yellowish line, is increasing year to year. On average, survivors are generally contacting the hotline about 2 to 3 times. It's common for survivors to call multiple times in order to build trust with the hotline before ever even asking for assistance. But that being said, over the past years, the ratio of the number of signals to the number of unique survivors reaching out is decreasing, which means that the hotline is becoming more efficient in addressing the survivors' needs on those earlier calls. When people reach out to the hotline, all communication is confidential, including the caller's contact information. There are, of course, exceptions, such as when the caller provides reportable details about a minor being abused, neglected, or trafficked, the caller is in imminent danger, threatens to harm themselves or others, or otherwise gives explicit permission to be contacted by law enforcement or service providers. In regards to confidentiality, the caller has several options when contacting the hotline. Callers can request to remain anonymous, which means that the caller wishes to remain completely anonymous to both the hotline and external parties. They could be confidential, so maybe they're willing for the hotline to know who they are and to contact them, but they otherwise like to remain anonymous to outside parties. And then otherwise they can be willing to be contacted, where we can share their contact information and other identifiable details with law enforcement or service providers. It's important to remember, though, that callers are in control of how much information they provide and have the option of remaining anonymous as long as they haven't provided identifying information. So they can remain anonymous as long as we don't know who they are and then they tell us that there's a child being trafficked or that they are a child being trafficked, and then we would have to report that information. But if we otherwise don't have the information, we can't report it. So since anyone can call the hotline, and we encourage all of you to reach out when you have questions or need assistance responding to a trafficking situation, we want to go through what to expect when someone does call the hotline. Every call, text, and chat will contain the same core components, even though every response will be unique, just as the situation is unique. Every signal begins with assessing the signaler's safety and continually assessing victim and survivor safety throughout the life cycle of a case. We will assess the needs and purpose of this call to the hotline. We'll assess the situation for trafficking. We'll respond to the signaler's needs, and we'll follow up with next steps, referrals, or reporting to law enforcement as needed. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on the main components in these next few slides. So the biggest one is safety. Every call that we have, every signal that we have begins with a safety check to make sure that it's safe to talk and to understand the limits of safely communicating. How long they'll be safe to talk, how to know when they're no longer safe to talk, and what particular dangers there may be. If the person calling us is in immediate danger, we'll advise them to hang up and call 911. Otherwise, we'll fully assess the signaler's safety as needed and work with the survivor to create a safety plan. This is also where we will try to address the issues of confidentiality and the scope of the hotline so that the signaler is aware of our reporting obligations and can control the amount of information they provide. Our top priority is safety of the potential victims reaching out to us, so depending on the situation, this part of the conversation may dominate the signal before we're really able to assess further for needs or trafficking. So here you can see a sample of how a text conversation might begin. In this case, the potential victim indicated that there is someone who may be unsafe to talk around and that that person is returning soon. In order to reduce potential harm, we established a code word that would tell me that it's no longer safe to text the potential victim, as well as a safe word that would tell us when it is now safe to talk again. In this situation, I would then go on to explain our reporting responsibilities if the potential victim is a minor or any other details that would fall under our reporting requirements. And I would also explain the two ways that we might be able to help someone leave their situation, which would be either through law enforcement extraction or by getting them connected to a service provider if they're able to get to a safe location. But let's say during the course of this conversation, the potential victim discloses that they're a minor or that they're under the age of 18. So if the potential victim is a minor, then we do care about all of the same elements as far as safety as we would for adults, but we're also going to be reiterating our obligations to involve law enforcement in order to ensure their safety. If the situation is an urgent situation that requires an immediate law enforcement response, then we will typically be trying to make that call at the same time as the signal. If the signal is coming in through chat or text, then that advocate or another advocate or supervisor will call out to our 24-hour contacts while still communicating with the potential victim. It's important to note, however, that chat and text conversation are often very long and drawn out, and we might not get the information indicating the person is a minor until well into the conversation. If it's a call, then we may have another advocate or a supervisor call out to law enforcement while the advocate is still communicating with the potential victim. However, depending on capacity, the advocate taking the call may be the one that calls law enforcement immediately after collecting the necessary information and making a plan with the potential victim to call us back when they're safe again. In this scenario, this example, I validate the potential victim's fears about reporting, but reiterate that we care about them and want them to be safe, and that we are required to involve law enforcement because they're a minor. At that point, the potential victim may stop communicating with us if they're afraid of a law enforcement response, and we will then only be able to share the minimal information we've collected so far. But in other scenarios, the potential victim may be scared, but ultimately still willing to communicate with the advocate and provide the requested information. In these types of situations, we would continue to assess for different areas of safety and other safety and danger information that law enforcement might need to know in order to respond. Here I'm assessing for where her potential trafficker is and the location of anyone else who she might be afraid of. And then here are some other examples of questions we might ask while assessing for safeties in a situation like this. In this case, she mentioned the potential trafficker's sister, So we want to know where she is and if she's a threat, if there's anyone else around who might hurt her, if they're hurt, if they need medical attention, if there's any other potential victims in the situation and what their conditions are. Also, phone safety, how long it'll be safe to text, if anybody monitors their phone, while encouraging them to delete any texts that they have with us or their chat histories. Also, are the potential traffickers armed? What sort of weapons do they have, and where are those weapons? What would the potential victim expect to happen if the traffickers found their text, or if law enforcement responded to the situation? How would the potential traffickers react? So this assessment will go on for as long as needed, depending on the situation. In urgent situations where we've quickly identified the need of extraction or otherwise leaving the situation, our primary focus is on safety. Throughout the safety assessment, we will be trying to assess for trafficking to the extent necessary in order to determine if we are the right fit. But depending on the urgency of the situation, that might be limited to asking questions to confirm, is someone making you have sex for money or drugs or something else? Or is someone forcing you to work against your will? If the answer is yes to that or some other version of that question, then we'll stop assessing to determine if it's trafficking and focus on questions relating to safety and information that will help law enforcement in their immediate response. Additional trafficking assessments may resume on a later signal from the potential victim, but in a crisis situation, getting all of the details of the trafficking situation is not a priority. It's also sometimes a fine balance between maintaining trust with the potential victim so they feel safe reaching out to us and getting enough information to confirm trafficking and inform law enforcement. If the crisis situation involves an adult that does not require a report to law enforcement, then we'll focus on the safety assessment and questions related to connecting the potential victim to a service provider, such as the type of trafficking, their age, gender, or nationality. However, if it's a situation involving a minor, we do try to get enough information about them, their location, and their traffickers in order to help law enforcement respond to an immediate situation without being too pushy and driving the potential victim away. Ultimately, as we discussed in the confidentiality slide, it is up to them to provide the information, and sometimes we do have limited details to share. While safety is a critical component of what we do on every signal, only about 10% of our signals are crisis situations that require such a lengthy safety assessment. The other main component, which makes up much of our response and follow-up to all situations, is assessing the needs of the signaler, and particularly of the survivor if the call is about a specific trafficking situation. Since our hotline has a very specific scope, we want to triage the call as soon as we safely can in order to determine if we can meet the needs of the caller. Some people might reach out and may not know who we are or what our limitations are, so in order to not have them spend too much time talking about a difficult situation, we make sure that they're calling about a trafficking situation and that they're looking to either report their situation or to get connected to services. If they're not in a trafficking situation or not ready to report or get connected to services, we'll help them connect to more appropriate resources as able while keeping our line open to those that we can assist. If the call or text or chat is about a particular trafficking situation, but the caller is not the survivor themselves, then you can expect our advocates to assess for the wishes and needs of the survivor. This is particularly true of adult survivors who may not want law enforcement involved for a variety of reasons, whether it's not safe to involve law enforcement yet, but there's been threats about law enforcement, or maybe a potential victim might not identify as a victim to law enforcement. If the person is a minor, we still want to understand their needs, as that will help us if it's a situation that requires a report to law enforcement, that will help us inform law enforcement about what to expect when they arrive there, as far as whether or not the potential victim will be cooperative or maybe not identify as a potential victim. Regardless of their age, we will try to get them connected to services if that's what they're seeking. Referral requests may be for case management, housing and shelter, legal services, counseling, or other mental health services, transportation assistance, among others. We will usually try to encourage the signaler to work with an existing case manager if there is one, but if there's not, or if the situation is out of the current case manager's scope, then we are happy to connect to another resource or to work with the current case management team depending on what the signaler's wishes are. I'll talk in a minute about how our referral process works, but first I want to talk a bit about our trafficking assessment, since we do need to complete some form of assessment in order to determine the best fit for referrals. On every call, we also have to do that trafficking assessment. We do this to determine if our resources are the right fit for this person calling us or texting us. At a minimum, signalers can expect us to confirm that there is an action, that recruitment, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person through the means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercial sex acts or forced labor. It's important to note here that we do not have the ability to certify that a situation is in fact trafficking, which is why we report things as potential victims and potential trafficking. We are not an investigative agency, and we cannot say for a fact that the potential victims we refer or report on behalf of are in fact victims of trafficking. We also do not have the ability to meet people face to face, making it difficult to verify people's ages and identities. Because we take a survivor-centered approach and a trauma-informed approach, we take what the potential victim tells us at face value and also take into consideration the re-traumatizing effects of retelling one's story repeatedly. Since we know that service providers will almost always have to conduct their own intake assessment, we limit the assessment questions to those we need to know in order to make a good referral. We need to confirm to some extent that the person seeking services was either forced to work against their will or forced to engage in commercial sex, or is a minor in a commercial sex situation for the referral we provide to be a good fit. This may be a very brief assessment if the purpose of the call is just to obtain a referral. However, if someone is seeking to also report their situation or a situation they observed, then we would need to complete a thorough assessment and collect all relevant safety and trafficking details for law enforcement to respond appropriately. Ultimately, callers are in control of how much information they're willing to provide the hotline and will not pressure somebody to report or to provide more information that they're not comfortable telling, though we may ask clarifying questions in order to determine if the situation is within our scope and what resources are the best fit. As I mentioned, crisis calls make up only about 10% of our signals, and there are numerous other reasons why someone may call the hotline, and it's not always a survivor calling directly. This chart provides a breakdown of calls related to types of cases made by individuals contacting the hotline in 2017. Tips and high-risk situations each made up about a third of our calls. High risk includes calls that may not have enough indicators of human trafficking, such as not having enough information about force, fraud, or coercion, but are considered to be high-risk situations for human trafficking. Calls with the primary purpose of getting a referral make up about 13% of our requests, and the remaining calls were for general information and technical assistance. In the cases where someone is reaching out to get connected to service providers for resources or seeking assistance in a crisis situation, our advocates are able to tap into a network of more than 3,000 service providers. Each referral given to a signaler is based on their unique needs, situation, and demographics. If a survivor is unable or doesn't want to get in contact with the hotline, they can also use our public referral directory to search for specialized human trafficking resources in their area. They can do this by going to our website, humantraffickinghotline.org, and there's a section for the referral directory. This directory includes almost 600 human trafficking specific direct and indirect service providers across the country. In Texas specifically, we have 122 direct and indirect service providers listed in our internal directory, not counting those providers located outside of Texas who may serve victims in or from Texas. 62 of these providers are identified as either anti-trafficking organizations or anti-trafficking programs. The remainder are organizations that don't focus on the issue of human trafficking, but because of the nature of their work, they are equipped to help human trafficking victims, such as domestic violence shelters, or organizations that provide the types of services that victims of trafficking might benefit from, such as shelter, transportation, legal assistance. So when someone does want to get connected to referrals, our preferred response is to warm transfer the signaler directly in with a service provider using that provider's preferred referral method. Sometimes that's through a private number that only the hotline has access to. If the signaler is unable to warm transfer for any reason, maybe they're reaching out via text or chat, or maybe they just don't have time to make that call at this moment, then we'll offer the best public referral information we have and provide it on the call, on the signal, and give any necessary instructions while managing expectations about the service provider's ability to respond through the given contact method. If the best method of referral is a private contact number, we will attempt to get permission for the service provider to contact the potential victim directly, so that we can make the call on behalf of the potential victim and have the service provider call out to them themselves. An alternative is to make a plan for the hotline to call out to the service provider and for the potential victim to reach back after a reasonable amount of time if they wish to remain anonymous. Before we go into what happens when we report, I do just want to touch base on what it means to be included in the directory and how to apply. When a service provider applies to be included in the public directory or our internal database, we go through a vetting process in order to determine if they are a good fit. We believe that quality services can be provided when an organization demonstrates these qualities, that the organization appears to practice victim-centeredness, that they appear to have sustainable managerial practices, that they appear equipped to provide services to human trafficking survivors, and that they are collaborative with potential partners in their area. So one of the major benefits of this new partnership with Texas is that we have those partners on the ground with the governor's office and other local service providers that are able to help with vetting organizations that apply to the directory. And so for organizations that apply from Texas, if they specifically say that they serve minor victims of trafficking, then I'll be reaching out to our partners in Texas in order to determine if that organization has met all of the state criteria in order to perform that service. And so when a survivor reaches out for options on leaving their situation, we're able to tap into these internal resources as well as our public resources and find either an anti-trafficking organization that can help or another organization that is otherwise able to help survivors of trafficking. I also want to note that a critical feature of being included in the directory is being available to respond to regular update requests. So this year, I've initiated the first round of annual update requests to all the service providers in our directory. For Texas, I have sent out the request to all providers that are in our listing for Texas. So if you are in our system or think that you're in our system, then somebody that has been designated as a point of contact for your organization should have received an email from me with a link. If you think that you should have received that email and have not, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address will be at the end of this presentation, and we can make sure that you get that link so that we can make sure that your information is updated. For those organizations that aren't already included in our directory, feel free to go to our website, again, humantraffickinghotline.org, and on the page for the referral directory, there's a link to our guidelines and expectations. And within that is also the link to the application. So feel free to go on there or reach out to me if you have any questions about that. I'm going to pass it on to Sam so that she can talk about our referral and reporting protocols and our process for reporting to law enforcement.
Hi everyone, my name's Sam Gillis. I'm Jenny's counterpart and work on our partnerships with law enforcement. As she stated, I'm just going to go over some of the hotline functions and procedures related to the law enforcement and reporting side. So for situations where reporting is required or appropriate, or a survivor requires immediate assistance from a service provider, we utilize our referral and reporting protocols that include networks of trained law enforcement and service providers that can provide emergency services and or coordination. The hotlines built these protocols up over time. Currently, we have about 290 emergency protocols based on geographic area. So if you take a look at this image on your screen, each shape on the map represents a particular protocol with law enforcement and service providers sometimes, oftentimes, to coordinate response to trafficking situations. These include emergency points of contact for both law enforcement and the victim service providers if they are available. So also please just note that this is an older map, so it doesn't exactly reflect how things are broken down today, but it's meant to give you a visual and just help you conceptualize how diverse they can be state to state and just individually within a state. So the ultimate goal of the protocols is to match our work or work effectively with the anti-trafficking landscape in a given area. In order to do that, we work with the relevant stakeholders in that locale to build them up. So think your local, state, and or federal law enforcement officers, government agencies, and service providers generally. Because of this, the contacts included on the protocols and their coverage area varies by location. So protocols could be hyper-local, dictating our response in a single county only, They could be regionally based, so think multi-county, or state-based, covering the entire state, like a statewide trafficking response. And they include contacts that work in that specific area. Usually this is a combination of local, state, and federal law enforcement. Sometimes the government agencies included, and then sometimes the service provider is also included on the physical tip. Depending on what the group wants, the hotline could report to a single point of contact, so just one individual in an area, multiple members of a task force, or more of an informal group of individuals that collaborate and deconflict effectively in that given area. The contacts that receive certain tips can also be broken down more granularly to serve the group as well. On some protocols, all contacts receive all of the tips. Everything is pretty standardized. And then on others, we report to a specific group of contacts based on the type of potential trafficking situation or the type of population of the victim involved. In Texas, we currently have 18 reporting protocols that cover all 254 counties. As you can see, I mentioned the map's old, so it's not reflected here, but currently there are 18. As you know, the state's pretty diverse in terms of population, communities, and trafficking response, and as such, there are some hyper-local county-level protocols. But I would say overall, Texas is mostly comprised of regional protocols that cover a cluster of counties together. It's also important to note that because our protocols are reflective of the field, a field filled with natural attrition in law enforcement, changes in funding for trafficking efforts, shifting areas of responsibility, and just different political climates, the protocols are always in flux. If you're not included on these distribution lists and you feel that you should be, please email me directly and I will see what I can do to remedy that, working with our other partners that are already on those protocols. All of our contact information will be included at the end of the presentation. So all of the reports that we send to law enforcement are sent out to the contacts on those protocols that I just mentioned, and they are sent out via email. We will supplement our written reports with a call out to our 24/7 emergency contact for cases that require an immediate response, or if they are tricky or sensitive for any reason that just require a little more explanation off the phone or offline. Jenny highlighted the Hotline's confidentiality policy earlier, which indicates that we are not required to report all incoming case information to law enforcement. However, there are a couple of big buckets that we are required to report to. The first one is minors in danger, and she mentioned this before, but that includes minors in trafficking situations, obviously. Our hotline advocates are considered mandated reporters, so any cases involving minor trafficking are reported to law enforcement as well as CPS if the specific state law requires it. Instances of child abuse and neglect would be reported to CPS only. We do still have an obligation to report that, even if it's not necessarily within our scope. So in regards to the trafficking cases, towards the beginning of each signal that we get on the hotline, it's required that hotline advocates inform signalers of the hotline's mandated reporting obligations and our confidentiality policy. This empowers callers to use discretion over what they choose to share with us. If we obtain any reportable details about a minor in a situation after that point, the hotline is required to make a report to law enforcement and Child Protective Services simultaneously. This is true even if we're speaking with a minor that does not want law enforcement or CPS involved. These cases are an exception to our confidentiality policy, and if the suspected minor has provided a city and state in which they are located but refused to provide any further information, including their phone number, we can pull the phone number and then we would report that information to law enforcement and CPS and just give them all of the information that we do have. The other three main buckets that we have to report, aside from minors in danger, are cases with indicators of imminent harm, so that's serious injury or death, or when we hear active violence on the phone or a signaler observed violence during the call or right before it. And then lastly, when a signaler is a potential victim themselves, a victim of trafficking themselves, and request that the hotline make a report on their behalf. This is regardless of whether they choose to provide their information in the report or if they would like to be anonymous in that report. If we get information that requires urgent law enforcement response, but it's not trafficking related, we'll also report that to the local authorities. So everything I just described falls into the urgent bucket that you see here at the top of the pyramid is 0 to 2 hour response time, except that last piece of adult survivors who want to report their situations to law enforcement. So sometimes can be urgent and they can sometimes be non-urgent. You know, an urgent example could be a adult victim requesting immediate assistance or needing an extraction. Non-urgent is a survivor, for example, just calling in a historical situation seeking to report their trafficker. For all other situations, we have discretion as to whether we report to law enforcement or not. We take a victim-centered and harm reduction approach. So every situation is evaluated for reporting on a case-by-case basis, considering the various nuanced factors that can come up in a case. I'll discuss this more in the next couple of slides, but I do want to just note here that all of our non-urgent tips are reviewed within 24 hours and then reported to the hotline law enforcement contacts within 24 hours after they've been reviewed and a decision to report has been made. So this slide is just a visualization of the process involving a signal made to the hotline about a potential trafficking situation involving minors in Texas. So you see the top left, the hotline receives either a call, text, web form, chat, or email about a minor in a potential trafficking situation. Then the hotline advocate discloses the hotline's mandated reporting and confidentiality policies, assesses for safety at that time, needs, assesses for trafficking, using all of the methods that Jenny outlined earlier in the presentation, and then obtains the information necessary for a report to law enforcement. Then after that, the hotline advocate calls the Texas Abuse Hotline of the Department of Family and Protective Services and attempts to warm transfer the caller into making a report with them. In situations where the caller does not want to be warm transferred or it's not appropriate given safety or whatever reason, the hotline advocate will then report the information themselves with the abuse hotline and provide the hotline case number that we have here. After that, the hotline will then craft a written report with all of the relevant information from the signal, including that a report was also made to the Texas Abuse Hotline. Then the report will be sent to all of the law enforcement contacts specified on the reporting protocol for the area, as well as the director of the Human Trafficking and Child Exploitation Unit within DSPS, the Texas DPS Human Trafficking Unit email, and then a supervisor within the Department of Public Safety as well. This is done to promote collaboration and aid in deconfliction so that the law enforcement officers who receive the tip can contact DSPS and vice versa if there's going to be a co-occurring investigation or if they need to share any information. We just felt that it made a lot more sense to have everybody on the same tip so then they could follow up as necessary. And as Jenny and I both stated before, there's several factors to consider when determining whether or not the hotline is obligated to report or whether it's prudent to report to law enforcement. The primary considerations that case reviewers are thinking about when deciding to assign a report are listed here. Case reviewers include our hotline supervisor teams and our case response specialists. The hotline supervisors supervise all of the hotline advocates in the room, and our case response specialists are responsible for more of the holistic case response that's non-urgent outside of the hotline room. So consent from a victim, age, and the safety of individuals involved are the most important factors that these case reviewers will be weighing whether or not, when they're considering whether or not to make a report to law enforcement. The supervisors, the kind of how it works, the supervisors are notified by the hotline advocates in the room about cases involving minors or cases involving imminent harm. So they'll be reviewing and assigning the urgent reports quickly, taking into account more of these definitive considerations for reporting. So urgency, safety concerns, age of the victims, minors just otherwise mentioned tangentially. They're looking at all of those cases. Our non-urgent cases, as I mentioned, are reviewed by that case response specialist team, and they are working to determine reporting on cases that are not urgent. So again, as I stated before, those decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, evaluating every nuanced factor in the case and determining whether as a whole reporting could be beneficial to the potential victims involved or whether it may ultimately cause more harm. We do this because we know that reporting to law enforcement is not the best solution for every case in every area, especially for the adult victims who will not identify as victims when approached, who have a contentious history with law enforcement, or who are undocumented. If it's a non-urgent situation and a victim or survivor wants to report their situation, our case response specialist will review the case and assign that report out. The reason they still review this information, you might think that, okay, if survivor's saying they want to report, we're just going to go ahead and report that. But we like to have another set of eyes on it just to see if there's any potential follow-up or additional conversations that need to be had before we make that report. One scenario where this need is particularly salient is when survivors are seeking to make that report, to report their trafficker or their traffickers anonymously. So depending on, if you think about it, depending on how many victims were in a trafficking situation, the methods of control used and with whom, et cetera, a trafficker may be able to determine who likely made that report based off those details, even if the reporting victim or survivor does not provide their name or contact information. We like to just go over all of that information with them and mitigate these potential risks as much as we can, or at least just notify the survivor of the risk so then they can make their own decision about whether they want to report knowing that risk. So when the hotline receives cases about potential trafficking involving an adult and we're unable to speak with the victim directly, the hotline staff will assess whether to report to law enforcement based on some of these other considerations listed here, including but not limited to the ones listed. So some of the more decisive factors in these situations are the caller's proximity to the situation. So does a family member, a friend, does somebody really know what the potential victim might want and what's actually going on here? The level of violence, the involvement of other potential victims, potential adverse consequences for reporting, and then the strength of the reporting protocol, those ones that I mentioned before are on the map. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about what those nuances are because we're talking generally about minors here, but feel free to ask questions later if you would like more detail about these. And it should just be noted broadly that the hotline's unable to verify whether tips are legitimate or confirm that human trafficking is occurring in any particular situation. Our experience has shown that the tips reported to the hotline in good faith have not resulted in adverse consequences for callers, but we maintain that law enforcement must engage in due process when investigating these tips, and signalers should not feel that they're expected to verify the validity of their claims before reporting to us. We're going to take a little break here just to see if you guys have any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat box. And Caroline, Jenny, and myself will answer them depending on who they're targeted at.
So we do have a few questions that came in. One is about the PowerPoint and notes and presentation, if it's going to be available after the webinar to share with your agency and community partners. Yes, it will be made available. Our partners at the governor's office will make all of the resources available after the webinar, and they will provide more information about that. How is data available for specific parts of Texas, such as Galveston County? I'll let Caroline answer this question.
So we have our data team, who is the one that produces the amazing reports and analyzes our data. However, we are very limited in our capacity on that team. So unfortunately, we're not able to provide such hyper-localized reports. However, through our partnership with the governor's office, we will be providing reports based on the 5 regions that Andrea talked about in the beginning of her presentation. The West Texas region, the North region, East, Central will be, and then the South region. Those will be reports that will be available. And then every year we do put out our annual statistics report on our website that you can access for the whole state of Texas. But unfortunately, due to capacity limitations, we are unable to do the hyper-localized reporting. If you do have a data request, you can always submit them to the email datarequests@polarisproject.org. But I would recommend giving several months, if not 6 months of a lead time in order to get those reports, if they are even a possibility. But that's where you can reach out for assistance with data requests.
All right, the next question was about the colors on the protocol map. I'm just going to go back to that really quickly just to emphasize. So this, again, is old, but the colors are just to show the different areas. It's not that one color means one thing or the other. It's just showing that every state is different. Some states might have one protocol for the entire state, while others may be divided into much smaller pieces. I also wanted to go back to the heat map just because this is a common question that I wanted to make sure is clear. The heat map is regarding the cases of human trafficking reported to the hotline. It's not necessarily what we're reporting to law enforcement. So sometimes we get questions about, okay, well, this is saying that there's so many cases reported in my district, but I'm not getting these reports. How come? It might just be that they're not reports that or cases that are being reported to law enforcement. Another question that we had was what percentage of tips are forwarded to law enforcement? And we have about 1/3 of our trafficking cases that go to law enforcement. And that's all of our trafficking cases in total, considering that we serve adults as well as minors. There was another question about, I'm going to pass to Sam, about if you can find out how many referrals have been made to law enforcement in a particular jurisdiction. I'll let Sam answer that.
Yeah, so that can be, that's a yes and no. It depends on what your jurisdiction is. We can break down how many reports were sent to law enforcement in a given like county or something, or a couple of counties, but largely we do that either based on protocol or based on the state. And we generally share that information with individuals that are on our reporting protocols or that work with the individuals that receive those reports. So it depends is the best way I can answer that. But if you would like that information, please feel free to email me directly, and then we can figure out if we're able to share it.
Then the last question that I've seen so far is, well, thanks first off to Shirley for the props to us. We are excited about the work that we're able to do with the governor's office and with Texas, and it's possible because of our partners on the ground. So thank you all for being there. Regarding any future webinars with updates, we will leave that up to the governor's office to advertise anything that is upcoming. There may be webinars that are more regional. I think those details are being hammered out, but definitely keep in touch with the governor's office and they will keep you up to date as far as any future dates. Are there any other questions before we move on?
We'll unmute you so you can, if you have any specific questions and haven't typed them in, you can speak. I think you all should be unmuted.
We're not going to unmute everybody so that everybody doesn't talk at once, but just go ahead and either, I don't know if you can raise your hand in this so I can unmute you one at a time, or just enter into the box if you have the ability to chat. I don't see anybody raising their hands, but I do see a question. Is there a mechanism to follow up with the hotline analyst to ensure our law enforcement partners are completing that follow-up on case status?
That would be, let me make sure I understand. So let me see if I understand this correctly. So if you are receiving our tips, is there a way to follow up to make sure that the tips are being handled correctly?
Dawn, I've unmuted you. I don't know if you have the ability to talk, but I've unmuted you in case we're not understanding.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. I'm the point of contact from Kathy West, who I think is on the chat as well, to our local law enforcement here. And one of the things that we require our law enforcement to do is ensure that they're following up with the analyst with any updates on those cases. And so I'm wondering if there is a mechanism for us to follow up with the analyst to ensure there's accountability on our end with our local law enforcement.
Sure. So every tip, thank you for the clarification. So every tip that we send out, our case analyst or case response specialist team is copied on them, so they're CC'd. And we do encourage all of the contacts that receive the tip to reply all and let us know what's being done. And the analyst will be included on that response. And if there was any reason why you wanted to just follow up with them directly and not the entire group, you can just email them directly from that, that thread.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Of course. And then the next question that I saw in the thread, I'm just going to answer generally, not necessarily specific to the organization, just because I think this is a question that's relevant to any service provider out there, is about once listed in the directory, will the hotline staff refer use to the location, to the service provider? And that is not anything that we can or would guarantee. Basically, how the referrals work is that we'll match the potential victim to the most appropriate service provider. If your organization is the most appropriate service provider in that area serving that demographic, then we will we'll try to warm transfer to the best fit, but we will often try to offer a couple different options in case there's any barriers that they face. And we also, the other thing that I want to know about saying that, you know, if there's that one prime organization, if we're always going to refer to them, the answer is not necessarily, because sometimes the potential victim will have particular preferences and we're always going to go with what the potential victim wants. So, you know, maybe they had a bad experience with that service provider or something like that, we would follow what their wishes are. And so as long as the information that we have in your listing is clear to our advocates about who is eligible and what services you offer and what those services entail, we'll be able to make the best referral possible. All right, I think if we don't have any other questions, we're going to move on to the next section.
So, yep, we're going to switch gears now a bit and review some data about minors that was compiled from hotline cases. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons the hotline is a critical tool for the anti-trafficking field and survivors is that we're able to collect a tremendous amount of data that we can use to identify trends and gaps in trafficking and services in the U.S. Data can be used to advocate for new laws that protect and support survivors, or for additional funding, or services that fill resource gaps. The slides in this section cover data reported to the hotline between January 1st, 2015 through June 30th, 2018. During this time frame, Texas had the second highest number of minor sex and labor trafficking cases reported to the hotline. We include sex and labor trafficking in these numbers because there are some cases where sex and labor do co-occur. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, which breaks down sex trafficking and labor trafficking cases involving minors reported to the hotline during the same time frame. On the left in blue, you'll see the number of cases and the associated minor victims in the U.S. And then in the right graph in green, the numbers for Texas. So in the U.S., there were 6,663 cases with 7,063 victims. And in Texas, there were 633 cases and 690 victims identified during the time frame mentioned earlier. Of the 633 cases reported in Texas, these are the top 5 types of sex trafficking and sex and labor trafficking involving minor victims. The order of types involving minors in Texas mirrors the U.S. data, and so the U.S. numbers are noted for comparison in this chart. So again, the top 5 are escort services, residence-based commercial sex, outdoor solicitation, bars, clubs, and cantinas, and illicit massage or spa businesses. These next couple slides will dive deeper into the minor victim demographics. As a reminder, the total victims identified for the U.S. were 7,063. And of those, 1,453 were U.S. citizens, 403 foreign nationals, and 7,063 unknown nationality. In Texas, the total number of victims identified was 690, and of those, 181 were U.S. citizens, 54 foreign nationals, and 455 unknown. Again, I want to mention the unknown category in a lot of our data. Again, data is not the primary focus for the hotline. It is secondary to assisting the caller and especially survivors and victims. And so therefore, there are times that we're not going to get the information, especially if it's a third-party individual calling in, or if it's a crisis situation and we don't have time to gather all the different demographics about the individual. So now with a better understanding of the key data points about minor trafficking in the U.S. and Texas, Jenny is going to speak about a few of the myths and misconceptions about trafficking.
Okay, so we're going to divert a little bit from that, and before rolling into a brief overview of the typology of trafficking, I wanted to talk about these myths and misconceptions. I've added a poll everywhere to these slides, so if you have the ability and want to participate in the polls, I have instructions on each of these slides. You text, either go to the website that's listed on the slide here, or text my name, Jenny Cell 460, to 22333 to join, and then you'll use that to answer the questions. All right, so the first question, and this should load here in a second if it's cooperating with me, is what are the common perceptions of human trafficking? If you were to ask someone on the street or your friends and family, what do you think that they would say about human trafficking? So once you join the poll, and let me see if I can get this to pop up right. There we go. So once you join the poll, you can respond multiple times to this question, and I'll show you the results. So go ahead and, if you want to, go ahead and respond through this text or through the website, adding in the words or statements that you think the common perspectives of trafficking is. No. Now that everybody's getting into the poll, I'll give you about a minute to enter your responses. If you have multiple responses, go ahead and enter them separately. Great, I'll let you keep adding these in. So I want to talk about, these are a lot of the common perceptions and misperceptions of what people have about trafficking, that it's smuggling, that it only happens to people that are in other countries, that it always involves kidnapping or some sort of, Taken-esque scenario, when in reality it looks like a lot of different things. We're going to kind of talk about these through different case scenarios. So the first case scenario, give it a second to load. All right, I'm going to deactivate this now. Try to move on to the next slide. There we go. So the first case scenario is that CPS responds to a tip that a 15-year-old male, Pedro, is being sexually abused in his home. Upon further investigation, the caseworker finds that Pedro's mother has been bringing adult men and women home to have sex with Pedro in exchange for drugs. Would you consider this trafficking? So on the next slide, it's a little bit lagging. I apologize for that. It should be the same number. There we go. I didn't want to show the results yet. So if you think that that situation is trafficking, Pedro, 15-year-old male, whose mother is having adult men and women have sex with him in exchange for drugs, yes. Text A, no, text B, or if you're not sure, text C. I'll give you about a minute to respond. All right, start showing the results. So yes. So the situation, thank you all. Situation is a minor sex trafficking situation. Basically, the debunked myths here are that the situation does not have to involve an exchange of money. It could be drugs, other basic necessities, and that human trafficking must involve some form of travel or transportation. That's the other myth that we often hear on the hotline, and when in fact it could happen in somebody's own home and never involve any sort of travel. I'm going to move on and just kind of give an overview of some of the other myths and misconceptions that we see on the hotline. You know, that they always come from other countries, that they're undocumented and brought here illegally, that it only occurs in illegal underground industries. Sorry about that. That the victim consented to be in their initial situation, then it can't be human trafficking. And the biggest one that we see all the time is that sex trafficking is the only form of human trafficking, when in fact labor trafficking is also a very important and dangerous issue, and that falls under the umbrella of human trafficking, which we handle on the hotline. All right. So if you want to see more about those myths and misconceptions, you can look on our website, and you'll also be able to see them in this presentation, since I did have to kind of go over them quickly.
Hi guys, this is Sam again. I'm going to go over a very brief overview of one of our major efforts over the last couple of years, and that's the development of the typology of modern slavery. We've been focusing a lot on sex trafficking, specifically sex trafficking as it relates to minors today, but we want to emphasize that there are more types beyond these sex trafficking types involving minors, and even if you exclusively work with minors on the sex trafficking issue, you may run into complex situations that involve multiple forms of exploitation or different types. So we just think it's wise that everybody has this framework to reference in case that you do come across these. So again, it's going to be really brief, but we encourage you to review the full report on our website. It's available at, it is available at polarisproject.org/typology. But so can you go to the next slide? Yes. Very briefly, Polaris analyzed more than 32,000 cases of human trafficking documented between December 2007, when we started the hotline, and December 2016 through the end of this project, through its operation of the hotline and the Be Free text line. This is the largest data set on human trafficking that's in the US that has been ever compiled and publicly analyzed. So you can see the figures on the right there. There were 32,208 human trafficking cases, and then 65% of those could then be classified into distinct types. And there were over 10,000 cases of labor exploitation, 60% of which could be classified into distinct types as well. There's various reasons why all of the cases couldn't be classified that I'm not going to get into right this second. But based on what we could ultimately classify, Polaris's research team identified 25 types of trafficking in the US. There were some limitations to this based on, like every study, the research is based on the hotline and text line cases, not random or structured surveys or standard interviews. And then we must consider that there are reasons why our data might be inherently skewed based upon who has access to our numbers, who has the means to self-identify and reach out, and just general awareness about certain types of trafficking that all impacts the information we do get. But I want to get into the meat of it, which is actually the 25 types. So these types are listed here. I hope you can see them all clearly, but they are divided between the cases of sex trafficking, cases of labor, and then cases of sex and labor. And they are organized here in ascending order of the most cases reported. So the most frequent case reported is escort services at the top there. And the sex trafficking types include escort services, illicit massage, health and beauty, outdoor solicitation, residential-based sex trafficking, bars, strip clubs, and cantinas, pornography, personal sexual servitude, remote interactive sexual acts, and illicit activities. And just to quickly refresh the slide that Caroline presented earlier, these are represented here in the top 5 types of minor sex trafficking and sex and labor trafficking. And if you really want to get a good idea of what the unique dynamics that are coming into play, the unique victim profiles and trafficker profiles per each type, that's why we have divided it. And we've also parsed out, based on the differences in unique business models, how these different types can be disrupted based on that, and then how law enforcement can target their investigations accordingly. So in longer presentations, Jenny and I go into the different profiles, but we don't have time to do that today. So again, it's all available online if you'd like to check that out for yourself. We're going to skip through what I just summarized and open it up for some questions here at the end.
Okay, so we did have a couple more questions that came in while we were presenting that last part. First question, are homeless children ever identified as trafficking victims? If the question is, would we identify a trafficking victim that may also be a homeless child, then yes. There are certainly cases where trafficking victims are homeless. Common, I don't know if common is the right word, but a scenario that might come across the hotline is if there's a youth that is exchanging sex for basic necessities, survival sex, then that could be trafficking, things like that. And homeless populations are definitely vulnerable populations for trafficking, so it's definitely something that we look out for. Of course, a child being homeless in and of itself is not trafficking, so we do sometimes get calls like that. And so we do assess for whether or not there's an exchange of sex or forced labor. And another question that we have is, if a community organization is ordering its own human trafficking awareness outreach material and wants to include the hotline's information on the item, is there a special process to apply for permission? I'm going to pass that to Caroline to answer.
So there's no process, and we actually are truly thankful for the organizations who are putting our number out and getting the awareness out about the number. So feel free to put the number, and I would encourage, if you work with youth, to put the texting number on the 233-733 or Be Free, as that is, again, as we talked about before, a preferred method of communication for youth. So no protocol, just go ahead and put the number on. However, if you did want to use the logo for something, we would ask that you reach out to one of us, and we can connect you with the appropriate communications people. But thank you for those of you who are putting that information out there.
All right, another question, and this might be a good question for the child sex trafficking team with Texas. What new information or procedures will be in place with the new partnership between Texas and Polaris?
So can we get a little more specific on that question? Maybe unmute so we can ask it.
Let me see if I can find her on here. All right, Christy, you're unmuted. Do you want to give a little bit more clarification on the question?
Sure. Can you hear me? Sorry about that, y'all.
All right, I muted you for a second, just to stop that.
Now?
All right, are you there, Christy?
Can you, yeah, Sharon, can you turn your volume off? Sorry, we've got multiple listeners here.
Sorry. It should be off.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, we won't be able to hear them. Okay, can y'all hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes, we can.
Yep. Okay, sorry. So I'm hearing kind of different things from the state, different things from Polaris, but kind of stuff we've heard. Is there going to be any changes to the way y'all work together? Are there going to be any changes to what we can expect from this partnership? Will there be will there be any results from the partnership, or is it just kind of like we're connecting everybody to work together? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so there are certain things that are part of the partnership, like we are working really closely together to beef up the directory, and you heard that we have already 122 internal direct and indirect Texas services listed on that directory. That's a huge number for one state, so we're continuing to work that way. Polaris is sharing data with us and with Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, and they will be looking at that data to kind of get more, I guess, knowledge and research into what trafficking looks like in Texas. We also have the hotline reporting all suspicious activity reports to DPS and sharing data with them to kind of build their intelligence about trafficking. And that facilitation of mandatory reporting is something that they don't do with other states. So they're actually educating their hotline advocates on Texas law with mandatory reporting. And then when people call in about a Texas incident, they let them know about the mandatory reporting statute and patch them in to the DSPS hotline. And they're able to, it's easier access to the hotline than if you wouldn't call. Easier access to the DSPS hotline than just calling the DSPS hotline. So there's several different aspects to the partnership. We'll also be working on webinars like this. We're planning on doing a webinar with the types of trafficking, kind of like just a sneak peek of that. We're planning on doing more of those, as well as some trainings around the state. So there's actually a lot to the partnership. We really want to get more and more and more people to understand that the hotline can connect not only to law enforcement, but also to services. And so we want to beef up that directory and make it our state directory for all of our services.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. And then there's a question about the website. I put up the contact information slide again, just so that people could take that down. I also entered the website into the chat so that you can record that there. Again, this recording will be available afterwards, so you'll have more opportunities to access this information. And then poster material that can be posted in your offices. There are materials that you can download from our website, and you're free to print them off. And then you can also go to the various campaign websites, like the Look Beneath the Surface website for specific campaign materials that will have our information on it as well. All right, was there any other questions?
Looks like we are then wrapping up right on time. I think everybody's ready to go. It's 3:30 our time, but I guess 2:30 your all's time. So if there are no other questions, we will end the webinar unless our friends in the governor's office want to say anything before we hang up.
No, I think that wraps it up. Just thanks everybody for being on the call. We will be sure to share the materials out with everyone. As was mentioned, if you have questions from your region, feel free to reach out to us. But if you have questions specific to the service provider directory, you can reach out to Jenny, whose contact info is there. And if you had questions about those protocols that Sam mentioned, her contact's there, and we're also happy to help facilitate and walk through any of those processes.
All righty. Well, thank you all again for joining us. We truly appreciate all the work you are doing on the ground. We would not be able to operate without all of you. So thank you again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.